The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Hospital hummed their eternal, slightly off-key song as Riley Hayes pushed her medication cart down the third-floor corridor. She'd been working the graveyard shift for the last 3 nights straight, and her feet were staging a full rebellion against her ankles. The scrubs that had felt crisp at 11 p.m. now clung to her like a second skin, and there was definitely a mysterious stain on her sleeve that she refused to acknowledge until she could stare at it under proper lighting. She wheeled the cart toward room 304, mentally calculating how many minutes remained until her shift ended at 8 a.m. 234 minutes. Not that she was counting. That's when she heard it. That particular tone of voice that made nurses throughout the hospital tense, like prey sensing a predator. This is incompetent, absolutely incompetent. How did this patient even make it through triage? Riley closed her eyes and took a breath that would have impressed a yoga instructor. Dr. Ethan Cross. Of course. She'd heard the rumors when she started at St. Catherine's 8 years ago. Brilliant but difficult, they'd said. Impossible to work with, someone had added. Over the years, Riley had come to suspect those descriptions were generous. Brilliant? Absolutely. Difficult? That was like calling a hurricane breezy. She'd managed to avoid direct confrontation with the cardiology department's star physician for most of her tenure. She'd perfected the art of the tactical retreat, the strategic disappearance, the well-timed break during rounds. It was a survival skill, like knowing which vending machine on the second floor actually accepted slightly worn bills. But the universe, it seemed, had tired of her evasion tactics. Riley rounded the corner to find Dr. Cross standing outside room 302, his white coat pristine and blindingly white, because of course it was, gesturing at a trembling resident with the kind of casual disdain usually reserved for people who microwaved fish in office break rooms. Dr. Ethan Cross looked like he'd been designed by someone with very specific opinions about what doctors should look like. Tall, angular, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to perpetually burn with intellectual superiority. His dark hair was perfectly styled in a way that probably took him approximately 45 seconds every morning and definitely wouldn't have dared to be out of place. Everything about him was controlled, deliberate, infuriating. And he was currently making 23-year-old resident Dr. Patterson look like he wanted to evaporate. The EKG interpretation is elementary, Patterson. I'd learned this in my second year of medical school. In fact, I'm quite certain a well-trained chimpanzee could... Dr. Cross. Riley's voice came out calm, reasonable. A person could have no idea that she was currently envisioning creative ways to introduce his head to the nearest wall. Could I speak with you for a moment? Ethan turned, and his dark eyes swept over her with the kind of dismissive glance usually reserved for people trying to sell him extended car warranties. Nurse Hayes, unless you've suddenly developed a medical degree, I don't think we have anything to discuss. I'm teaching Dr. Patterson what should have been taught months ago. Me? The word nurse carried a particular inflection, the way someone might say, person who collects shopping carts in parking lots. Riley had taken abuse from doctors before. It was as much a part of hospital work as hand sanitizer and the constant, bone-deep exhaustion. She'd learned long ago not to take it personally. This man was clearly miserable, wrapped so tightly in his own insecurity and intellectual arrogance that he probably hadn't had a genuine human connection in years. Pity him, the veteran nurses counseled. He's just terrified. But at 7:48 in the morning, on her third consecutive night shift, after holding a 73-year-old woman's hand while her family said goodbye and having spilled coffee on herself twice, Riley's capacity for pity was running lower than the hospital's supply of working pens. Actually, she said, keeping her voice level and pleasant, the dangerous kind of pleasant that her mother had perfected over decades, I think you need to sit down. The corridor went quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happens in movies right before something catastrophic. Ethan's expression shifted, just slightly, but it was visible. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "Sit down," Riley repeated, with the kind of gentle firmness usually reserved for genuinely small children who were about to make a terrible decision. "Right now, take a break. Get some coffee. Somewhere that is not here, not making a resident question his competence, not spreading whatever particular sourness you're experiencing this morning all over this hallway. Doctor." Patterson looked like Christmas had come early and also brought presents. Dr. Cross looked like someone had just informed him that his Harvard diploma had been revoked. "I don't require a nurse to tell me how to conduct my rounds," he said quietly. Dangerously quietly, the kind of quiet that suggested a very expensive piece of equipment was processing whether to shut down or explode. "No," Riley agreed, "you require someone to tell you that common human decency isn't optional, and apparently they failed spectacularly, so here I am, filling in the gap. Sit down, Dr. Cross, or I can help you do it." There was a pause. Behind them, a heart monitor beeped steadily. Someone coughed in a distant room. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal, slightly off-key song. And then, because this particular Monday morning had apparently decided to commit fully to chaos, the rest of the surgical team rounded the corner. All of them. Residents, attending physicians, even Dr. Patricia Okonkwo from administration, who had the look of someone who was about to have a very interesting day. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared. Dr. Cross stared at Riley. Riley stared at Dr. Ross. Dr. Patterson stared at both of them with the expression of someone watching a particularly good episode of television. "Nurse Hayes," Dr. Okonkwo said carefully, the way a person might address someone holding a suspicious package. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Riley said, not breaking eye contact with Ethan. "I was just suggesting that Dr. Cross might benefit from a break. He seems a little tense." "I am not," Ethan began, his voice tight. "Tense? Actually, tense might be generous. Maybe absolutely insufferable is more accurate," Riley continued, speaking over him with the kind of audacity that suggested she'd either just made the best decision of her career or was about to make the worst. He was making Dr. Patterson feel terrible for a perfectly reasonable interpretation that wasn't even significantly incorrect. And I think we can all agree that we have enough stress in this hospital without adding unnecessary humiliation from people who should know better. The silence deepened. It became geological. It probably had its own Wikipedia page. Dr. Cross's face had gone a particular shade of red that probably wasn't great for his cardiovascular health, which was ironic considering his specialty. He started. "Nurse Hayes," Dr. Okonkwo interrupted gently, "perhaps you should take a break as well." "I get off in 1 hour and 45 minutes, Riley said. "I can wait." But she did step back from Dr. Cross, releasing her eye contact and turning to Dr. Patterson with a reassuring smile. "The EKG interpretation was good work, Dr. Patterson. The ST elevation was subtle, easy to miss until you've seen about 2,000 of them." Dr. Patterson looked like he might actually cry with gratitude. Riley wheeled her medication cart away, her head high, her heart pounding, already mentally composing the resignation letter she was probably about to write. In a hospital this size, in a department this connected, Ethan Cross had the kind of influence that could end her career. He was the golden boy, published, respected, recommended by patients, and she'd just... "Miss Hayes?" She stopped. "Didn't turn around. That was completely inappropriate," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly. "You undermined my authority in front of my team. You will hear from administration." Riley did turn around then, and the expression on her face was sad in a way that surprised even her. "Dr. Cross," she said quietly, "if you need administration to support your authority enough that a nurse standing up for a resident threatens it, then maybe the problem isn't my behavior. Maybe the problem is that nobody actually respects you, and I think somewhere deep down you probably know that." She watched his face cycle through several emotions, anger, shock, and something that might have been recognition before he buried it under controlled fury. Then she turned back around and continued down the hallway, her medication cart creaking slightly, her legs aching, her career potentially flaming out behind her. It wasn't until she was in the medication room, hands shaking as she tried to organize pill bottles, that she let herself consider what she'd just done. She'd just publicly humiliated one of the most powerful doctors in the hospital. In approximately 4 hours, she was probably going to be very, very sorry. What she didn't anticipate, what nobody could have anticipated, was that by next Monday, she and Dr. Ethan Cross would be assigned to work together. That the hospital administration, tired of conflict between departments, would decide that the only solution was forced collaboration, and that somewhere in the next 6 weeks, as they planned a cardiology outreach program together, she would begin to suspect that underneath all that arrogance was a person worth saving. But that's a story for later. Right now, all Riley could think about was how good her bed was going to feel, and how much she was definitely going to regret this day. Riley had made it exactly 4 hours and 28 minutes before her phone rang. She was home, in her small apartment in Cambridge, still wearing her scrubs because she'd been too mentally exhausted to change. The coffee table held the remnants of lunch, a container of leftover Thai food she'd picked at without really tasting, and she was attempting to convince herself that she deserved a nap before the existential dread fully settled in. The phone buzzed against the couch cushion where she'd thrown it, unknown number. She almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail, continue her descent into denial. But 8 years of nursing had trained her to answer unknown numbers. They could be the hospital, they could be important, they could be the end of things as she knew them. She picked up. Ms. Hayes. Ah, a woman's voice, professional, carefully neutral in the way that hospital administrators perfected over years of delivering both good news and career-ending decisions. This is Dr. Patricia Okonkwo from St. Catherine's Human Resources. Do you have a few moments to talk? Riley's stomach executed a perfect dive into her intestines. Of course, she said, sitting up straighter as if Dr. Okonkwo could somehow see her through the phone and judge her for slouching. Is everything all right? There was a pause. The kind of pause that made Riley's anxiety do acrobatics. I'm calling regarding the incident this morning with Dr. Cross, Dr. Okonkwo began, and Riley's brain immediately started drafting a resignation letter that would at least maintain her dignity. Dr. Cross has filed a formal complaint about your conduct during rounds. Here it comes, Riley thought. Here's where they tell me I'm fired. However, Dr. Okonkwo continued, and something in her tone had shifted. Something that sounded almost like suppressed amusement. I've also received approximately 15 emails from other staff members, 3 of whom are attending physicians, describing Dr. Cross's behavior this morning as unprofessional, degrading, and a consistent pattern of harassment. Riley blinked at her apartment wall, not entirely sure she was following. I've also received 1 email from Dr. Patterson stating that you prevented him from having a complete emotional breakdown in front of his colleagues, Dr. Okonkwo added. And I've personally reviewed Dr. Cross's email records, which reveal that he regularly sends emails to residents that could charitably be described as emotionally abusive. Oh, Riley said. So here's what's going to happen, Dr. Okonkwo continued, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she'd already made several decisions and wasn't particularly interested in debate. We are not firing you. We are, in fact, quite pleased with your willingness to stand up for a colleague. However, we do need to address this situation more systematically. Riley waited, sensing there was an "and" coming. There was. And, Dr. Okonkwo said, we need Dr. Cross to attend mandatory anger management counseling and a professional development seminar on leadership and emotional intelligence. Hospital policy requires that any physician with multiple complaints regarding interpersonal conduct participate in such programs. Okay, Riley said carefully, still not entirely sure what this had to do with her. The complication, Dr. Okonkwo said, is that Dr. Cross is refusing to take this seriously. He's insisting that this is a witch hunt, that you deliberately provoked him, and that the entire situation is beneath his dignity to address. Riley closed her eyes. So, Dr. Okonkwo continued, administration has decided to implement a collaborative project that will require Dr. Cross to work with you for the next 6 weeks. We're launching a new cardiology outreach program, something we've been planning for months but have been unable to properly structure. We need it to be community-focused, compassionate, and designed by someone who understands both the medical and human aspects of care. It took Riley approximately 3 seconds to understand what was happening. No, she said, absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. Why? Dr. Okonkwo asked, and Riley could hear the smile in her voice now. You clearly have excellent communication skills. Dr. Cross is one of our finest cardiologists. Together, you could create something meaningful. He hates me, Riley said flatly, and the feeling is mutual at this particular moment. Not necessarily, Dr. Okonkwo said. You stood up to him. That's something most people don't do. I suspect Dr. Cross has spent so much of his life with people who either fear him or flatter him that he's forgotten what genuine human interaction looks like. That's his therapist's problem, Riley said, not mine. Actually, Dr. Okonkwo said, her tone becoming more serious, it's going to have to be both of yours. Dr. Cross will be attending the mandatory counseling regardless, but this project, it's an opportunity for him to work with someone who isn't intimidated by him, who will call him out when necessary, and who clearly cares deeply about patient care, and an opportunity for you to develop leadership experience. This will look excellent on your permanent record. Riley wanted to argue further. She wanted to point out that forced collaboration with someone you'd publicly humiliated was a recipe for disaster. She wanted to explain that Dr. Cross would probably sabotage the entire project out of spite, but Dr. Okonkwo continued before she could. Your first meeting is scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. in Conference Room B, Dr. Okonkwo said. I'll email you the project outline. You'll have access to the budget, the timeline, and community resources. I expect the two of you to develop a preliminary proposal by next Monday. Dr. Cross has already been informed. And if he refuses? Riley asked. Then he'll be on administrative leave, pending a full investigation into his conduct, Dr. Okonkwo said simply. But I don't think he'll refuse. Dr. Cross is arrogant, but he's not stupid. He understands that this is the path of least resistance. The call ended 5 minutes later, leaving Riley sitting on her couch in her scrubs, staring at the Thai food container, wondering if it was too early in the day to open a bottle of wine. Meanwhile, in a much nicer apartment in Back Bay, Dr. Ethan Cross was experiencing something remarkably similar. His apartment was exactly what one would expect: minimalist, expensive, impeccably organized, and devoid of any item that didn't serve a clear, functional purpose. The walls were painted a soft gray. The furniture was modern and uncomfortable looking in the way that expensive furniture often was. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Boston Common, and the evening light streamed in with the kind of golden quality that suggested the universe was mocking him. Ethan stood at those windows, his phone pressed to his ear, trying to maintain his composure as his lawyer explained the hospital's position. "They can't force me to work with her," Ethan said, hearing the tension in his own voice. That's harassment. That's unprofessional." "Actually," his lawyer said, "a woman named Susan Chen, who had been advising him for years and had, over that time, become increasingly frank about her opinions regarding his interpersonal skills. It's entirely within their purview as your employer. They're not punishing you. They're implementing a collaborative project. The fact that it happens to involve the nurse who publicly humiliated you is, technically, coincidental." "It's not coincidental," Ethan spat. "It's deliberate. They're punishing me for her insubordination. Are they? Susan asked mildly. Because from what I'm reading in the documentation they sent me, there are 15 complaints about your conduct on file. 15, Ethan. And that's just the ones people bothered to write down. How many conversations do you think happen where people decide you're not worth the effort of formal complaint? Ethan didn't answer. Here's my advice, Susan continued. Take the project. Work with Nurse Hayes. Try, and I know this will be difficult for you, try treating her like a human being with valid perspectives. Complete the counseling program. Demonstrate that you're capable of professional growth. In 6 months, this will all be behind you. And if I don't, then you'll be placed on administrative leave. Then you'll face a formal investigation. Then, depending on what they find, you might lose your position here. You're brilliant, Ethan, but you're not so brilliant that another hospital would hire you after that kind of scandal. And you're definitely not brilliant enough to be worth the liability you currently represent. Ethan hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He stood at the window for another 10 minutes, watching the common below, watching people walk together, talk together, exist together in ways that didn't seem to require constant vigilance and defensiveness. His phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Okonkwo, outlining the project details. He read it once, then again, his jaw clenching with each word. Cardiology Outreach Program. Community-focused, 6 weeks. Nurse Riley Hayes as co-director, the woman who had told him to sit down in front of his entire team, the woman who had suggested that nobody actually respected him, the woman who, and this was the part that really bothered him, the part he'd been trying not to think about all day, had been absolutely right. Thursday arrived with the kind of weather that felt specifically designed to match the mood of two people walking into a conference room, determined to dislike each other. It was grey and slightly cold, the kind of Boston weather that made you question why you'd chosen to live on the East Coast. Rain threatened the horizon. The hospital's fluorescent lights seemed even more aggressively fluorescent than usual. Riley arrived at Conference Room B at 1:59 p.m., which she knew was aggressive, but also felt necessary. She wanted to be there first, to have claimed the power position, to have established that she wasn't intimidated. She was carrying a folder full of notes she'd prepared over the past 3 days, ideas for the community outreach program, preliminary budget considerations, potential locations, and community partners. She'd thrown herself into the work with the kind of intensity usually reserved for people trying to prove something. She was proving that she was professional. She was proving that she was capable. She was proving that she wouldn't let Dr. Ethan Cross's presence or his disdain stop her from doing excellent work. The door opened at exactly 2 p.m. Of course it did. Of course Dr. Cross would arrive precisely on time, not a minute early, not a minute late. Probably maintained his reputation through sheer force of will and Swiss watch precision. He was wearing his white coat because apparently he'd come directly from clinic, and his expression suggested that he'd rather be literally anywhere else. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept particularly well. There was a tiny scar along his left jawline that Riley had never noticed before, pale and thin, and somehow making him look more human and less like a marble statue of human perfection. She immediately looked away from the scar. This was not a good direction for her thoughts. "Nurse Hayes," he said, his tone suggesting that the words tasted like something unpleasant. "I see we've been forced into this collaboration." "By administration," Riley said, keeping her voice level. "Yes. Hi. Good to see you too." Ethan pulled out a chair directly across from her, maintaining the maximum possible distance while still technically being in the same room, and sat down with the kind of precise movement that suggested he'd never dropped anything in his life. "Let's establish some ground rules," he said. "I will treat this project professionally. I expect the same from you." "That means what, exactly?" Riley asked, opening her folder. "Because I was treating the situation professionally on Monday." I was treating you professionally. I just wasn't letting you treat other people badly. You made a scene, Ethan said coldly. You were being cruel, Riley countered. There's a difference. They stared at each other across the conference table. Riley could see his jaw clench. She could see him take a breath, like he was physically restraining himself from saying something cutting. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no warmer. I don't require a lecture on my behavior from a nurse who doesn't understand the pressure of my position. You're right, Riley said, surprising them both. I don't understand the pressure of being a cardiologist. I also don't think that pressure justifies treating residents like they're incompetent for having a slightly different interpretation than yours. I understand the pressure of managing 12 patients at once while dealing with families in crisis, insurance issues, and not getting a bathroom break for 8 hours. I understand the pressure of genuinely life-and-death situations where one mistake costs someone their family member, and I manage that pressure without regularly humiliating people. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'm not here to rehash Monday, Riley said, pushing the folder across the table toward him. I'm here to do this project. If you want to make it hell, fine, but I'm not going to engage with personal attacks. And I'm not going to apologize for standing up to you, because I'm not sorry I did that. Ethan looked at the folder like it might bite him. He didn't touch it. What's in there? He asked. Community outreach ideas, Riley said. I spent the last 3 days researching underserved populations in the Boston area. There's a significant community health need in Roxbury and Dorchester. People with limited access to cardiology care, limited preventative screening, high rates of heart disease, but few resources for education or treatment. I thought maybe we could design a program focused on screening and education in those communities. 3 clinics, teaching sessions about risk factors, connections to resources for people who need ongoing care. She watched his face as she spoke, looking for something. Some sign of the person Dr. Okonkwo had suggested was underneath all the arrogance. That's ambitious, he said finally. That's the point of a 6-week program, Riley replied, to create something ambitious. Ethan opened the folder. He read quietly, his expression unreadable, making small notation marks with a pen he'd somehow produced from his white coat. It took him approximately 7 minutes to review everything. These community locations are problematic, he said, pointing to one page. This clinic has limited electrical infrastructure. Some of our screening equipment requires specific voltage requirements. Then we work with their maintenance team to figure out solutions, Riley said. Or we bring portable equipment. That defeats the purpose of establishing a sustainable program, Ethan said. If we can't establish stable infrastructure, we're not abandoning locations just because they're inconvenient, Riley interrupted. That's the whole point. That's why these communities are underserved, because it's easier and more profitable to set up clinics in wealthy neighborhoods. We're supposed to be fixing that. Ethan set down his pen. You're right, he said. Riley blinked. I'm sorry, she said. You're right, Ethan repeated, meeting her eyes. The point of an outreach program is to reach people who don't currently have access. I was thinking like an administrator, not like someone actually trying to help. That was narrow-minded. It was possibly the least graceful apology Riley had ever heard, but it was still an apology. Thank you, she said carefully, like she was acknowledging that something fragile had just occurred and they both needed to be gentle with it. Ethan went back to the folder. This is good work, he said. I have some concerns about timeline and resource allocation, but the bones of it are sound. When can we visit these locations? Whenever you're available, Riley said. Tomorrow afternoon, Ethan asked. I have a light schedule. We could see 2, maybe 3 sites. Okay, Riley agreed. Tomorrow afternoon. They worked for another hour, establishing basic parameters for the project, dividing responsibilities, identifying what information they'd need to gather. Ethan was different when they were working, less defensive, more focused. He asked genuine questions instead of making dismissive statements. He listened when Riley explained why certain approaches would work better in particular communities. It was possible, Riley thought, that they might actually be able to do this. At 4:15 p.m., Ethan stood to leave. "Thank you for coming prepared," he said, which was possibly the closest he was capable of getting to a compliment. "It makes the process more efficient. Thank you for actually considering ideas instead of dismissing them out of hand," Riley replied. He paused at the door. "I'm not actually interested in being the person you apparently think I am," he said quietly, without turning around. "I'm not sure how to be anything else, but I recognize that it's a problem." Then he left, leaving Riley sitting in conference room B with a folder full of notes and the strange feeling that something had just shifted. Not fixed, far from it, but shifted in a direction that might possibly lead to something other than disaster. She texted her best friend Sarah, "I think I might survive this project. Ask me again tomorrow." Sarah responded with, "Is this the arrogant doctor?" "Yes," Riley typed back. "Did something happen?" Sarah asked. "Maybe," Riley typed, "or maybe I just imagined it." "Let me know," Sarah said. And Riley? Be careful. Guys like that are usually broken in ways that look interesting until you actually get involved. Riley set down her phone and started organizing her notes. Sarah was right, probably, but for some reason she thought about Dr. Ethan Cross's dark eyes and the way he'd admitted he was wrong, and the small scar on his jawline that made him look less like a marble statue and more like a real person who'd been through things. It was dangerous territory, but 6 weeks was just 6 weeks. How much trouble could they get into? The parking lot of Roxbury Community Health Center was not what Ethan Cross was accustomed to. The building itself was functional rather than impressive. A converted warehouse with large windows that let in natural light and a cheerful blue door that someone had painted relatively recently. The neighborhood around it was active and alive in a way that downtown Boston, with its polished facades and expensive coffee shops, decidedly was not. People moved through the streets with purpose. A bodega on the corner had hand-painted signs advertising fresh produce. The smell of someone cooking, cilantro and garlic and something else Ethan couldn't quite identify, drifted through the afternoon air. He parked his Tesla in a spot that seemed incongruous in this environment, then waited for Riley to arrive. She pulled up in a 10-year-old Honda that had definitely seen better days, painted a practical silver color and displaying a small crack in the back windshield. She got out, and Ethan noticed she was wearing jeans and a soft green sweater instead of her scrubs, civilian clothes that made her look younger, more approachable, less like someone who worked in the sterile environment of a hospital. "Hi," she said, approaching his car with a thermos in one hand and a folder in the other. "Thanks for doing this. I know this neighborhood isn't what you're used to." "How do you know what I'm used to?" Ethan asked, getting out of his car. "You drive a Tesla that costs more than my car and probably my apartment combined," Riley said matter-of-factly. "You live in Back Bay. Your shoes cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Safe assumption that Roxbury isn't a regular destination." Ethan looked down at his shoes. Italian leather, handmade, from a cobbler in Boston's financial district. He'd never really thought about how they'd look to someone like Riley, which probably said something about him that he didn't particularly want to examine right now. "Fair assessment," he said. They walked toward the community center together, and Ethan noticed the way people responded to Riley. A woman carrying groceries waved at her and called out, "Hey, Riley, your mom making that chicken again this weekend?" A teenager, shooting hoops on a nearby court, shouted, "Nurse Hayes, my grandma says hi." "Hey, Mrs. Chen," Riley called back to the first woman. "Tell my mom to save some for Sunday." To the teenager, she yelled, "Tell your grandma I said she's a fighter." Ethan found himself watching her interact with the community, genuinely watching, not just observing in the way he observed surgical residents or administrative staff. She knew these people. They knew her. There was an ease and authenticity in these interactions that stood in sharp contrast to his own carefully maintained professional distance from everyone. The inside of the community center was bright and welcoming. The walls were painted in soft yellows and blues. There were plants in the windows. Someone was clearly caring for them, not just leaving them to die like most office plants. The receptionist was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a genuine smile. "Riley," she exclaimed, standing up from her desk. "Good to see you, honey. This your new doctor?" "This is Dr. Cross," Riley confirmed, introducing him with a tone that suggested she was still figuring out how to present him. "He's helping me with a new outreach program." "Dr. Cross, this is Maria. She's the heart of this place." Maria laughed. "I'm the receptionist, but I'll take heart of the place. Come on back. Dr. Rodriguez is expecting you." Dr. Alejandra Rodriguez, no relation to Riley, despite the shared name, was the director of Roxbury Community Health Center. She was in her mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair, intelligent eyes, and the kind of exhausted dedication that came from caring deeply about a job that never paid quite enough and always demanded more. "Dr. Cross," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Riley's told me a lot about you, mostly that you're a brilliant cardiologist with some issues with people skills." Ethan wasn't sure whether to be amused or mortified. He settled for honest. "That's accurate," he said. Dr. Rodriguez smiled at him, and something about her expression suggested she'd just decided he might be worth her time. "Come on, let me show you what we're working with." The tour was both impressive and depressing in equal measure. Impressive because Dr. Rodriguez was clearly doing remarkable work with limited resources: preventative care clinics, chronic disease management, mental health services, nutrition counseling, all delivered with genuine care to a population that desperately needed it. Depressing because it was obvious that the resources were genuinely limited. The equipment was older than what Ethan used at St. Catherine's. The space was cramped. The waiting room often had people standing because there weren't enough chairs. "We have about 8,000 patients in our active panel," Dr. Rodriguez explained as she walked them through the facility. 93% are at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. 68% are people of color. Most have no primary care outside of our clinic and emergency departments. The hypertension rates in this community are 23%, significantly higher than national averages. The diabetes rates are similar. "And cardiology services?" Ethan asked. "Non-existent," Dr. Rodriguez said bluntly. "We refer people to St. Catherine's or Boston Medical Center when they need cardiology. But most of our patients can't afford the time off work for appointments, can't afford the parking, can't navigate the system. So they don't go. They end up in emergency departments with heart attacks or strokes that could have been prevented with basic screening and management." She led them to a small clinic room, clean, equipped with basic equipment, but nothing compared to St. Catherine's state-of-the-art facilities. "This is where the magic happens," Dr. Rodriguez said, "or where it would if we had the resources and the expertise. We can do basic EKGs, we can manage some hypertension, but anything complex? We're out of our depth." Ethan found himself thinking about Dr. Patterson, the resident he'd humiliated on Monday. Dr. Patterson would graduate from his training and probably end up somewhere prestigious, somewhere comfortable, somewhere far from places like this. People like Dr. Patterson had choices. The patients in this clinic often didn't. "What would you need," he heard himself asking, "to establish a basic cardiology screening program? Something sustainable, something that wouldn't require constant expert intervention." Dr. Rodriguez and Riley exchanged glances. "Honestly," Dr. Rodriguez said, "funding for equipment, training for staff. Some of my nurses have excellent clinical instincts, but no formal cardiac training. A physician willing to come in regularly to do screenings and provide consultation. And she added, looking directly at Ethan, we'd need someone from the bigger hospital system to help bridge the gap between us and referral specialists. someone willing to advocate for our patients when they can't advocate for themselves. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, something that might have been shame or guilt or the uncomfortable recognition of privilege he'd never really examined before. "I can do that," he said. Riley turned to look at him, surprised. "I can come in weekly," Ethan continued, working through the logistics as he spoke. "We can develop a training program for your nursing staff. We have equipment at St. Catherine's that we could potentially duplicate here, and I can ensure that any of your patients who need specialty care get it, not just referred to the system, but actually followed up, actually advocated for." "That's a significant commitment," Dr. Rodriguez said carefully. "This isn't a prestigious program. The accolades won't be substantial. Most of the work will be unglamorous." "I'm aware," Ethan said, and to his own surprise, he found he didn't really care. The prestige, the accolades, when had those become more important than actual patient care? When had he lost sight of why he'd become a doctor in the first place? They spent the next 2 hours walking through the clinic, talking to patients, understanding the community's needs. A woman named Mrs. Jackson, 73, with poorly controlled hypertension and a family history of early heart disease, sat down with them and described the pain in her chest when she climbed stairs, the exhaustion, the fear that something was wrong, but the inability to get answers because she couldn't afford to take time off work. Ethan found himself doing something he rarely did. He listened. He actually listened, not just collected data. He asked her about her life, her family, what she ate, how much she slept, what she was most worried about, and when she got emotional talking about her grandson, how she wanted to be alive to see him graduate. Ethan found himself reaching across the table and squeezing her hand. It was not something Dr. Ethan Cross, cardiologist and acclaimed physician, typically did. After they left the community center, Ethan and Riley sat in their cars in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving to the next location. Riley had texted him the addresses. They were visiting 3 sites today. Ethan sat in his Tesla, hands on the steering wheel, and felt something that he recognized as the dissolution of certainty. He'd been very certain about most things for a very long time, certain that his intelligence and skills made him superior, certain that people's reactions to him were the result of their inadequacy, not his arrogance, certain that his career success was the most important measure of his value. None of those certainties felt particularly solid at the moment. His phone buzzed, a text from Riley. "You okay? You seem quiet." He typed back, "Yeah. Just thinking." "About?" she asked. "How much I don't actually know," he replied. There was a pause. Then, "That's growth. Let's get food before the next site. I know a place." The place turned out to be a small Dominican restaurant tucked between a laundromat and a cell phone repair shop. The menu was handwritten, the chairs didn't match, and the music from the radio in the kitchen was loud and energetic. It was nothing like the restaurants Ethan usually frequented. It was infinitely better. They ordered at the counter. Riley got something called mofongo with chicken. Ethan got a rice and bean dish that tasted like genuine food rather than something prepared by someone whose primary goal was presentation. They sat at a small table by the window, and the woman behind the counter kept stopping by to chat with Riley, asking about her family, offering opinions on the Celtics, treating her like someone who belonged here. "You come here a lot?" Ethan asked. "Once a week, usually," Riley said. "My mom grew up in this neighborhood. My abuela still lives here. It's where I'm from, basically. I only moved to Cambridge for nursing school." "Why nursing?" Ethan asked. It was a question he'd never really thought to ask before, had probably assumed the answer was something obvious like, to help people, or because it's a good job. But he was beginning to realize that people's motivations were usually more complex than that. "My abuela had a stroke when I was 14, Riley said quietly. "I was home sick from school. My mom had already left for work. She's a teacher. My abuela collapsed in the kitchen, and I called 911, and I stayed with her. The paramedics came, And the nurse who was working with them, her name was Diane. She was so calm, so kind, so competent. She kept talking to my abuela in Spanish, even though she wasn't technically supposed to be doing that. She held her hand. She made my abuela feel safe while everything was terrifying. Riley paused, eating a bite of her mofongo. My abuela survived, she continued. She's still alive, still in this neighborhood. And when I was choosing what to do with my life, all I could think about was Diane. How she was the most important person in that whole situation, how her presence mattered as much as any doctor's medication. So I decided to be like that, to be the person who holds someone's hand while everything is terrifying. Ethan found himself thinking about the patients they'd met at the community center. He thought about Mrs. Jackson and how he'd squeezed her hand, and how it had been one of the most meaningful moments of his recent professional life. That's beautiful, he said, and meant it. That's why I couldn't stay quiet on Monday, Riley added, when you were being cruel to Dr. Patterson. All I could think about was how many future patients he'll treat better or worse based on what he learned from you. Your behavior matters, Dr. Cross. It shapes how the next generation of doctors treat people. Ethan, he said. What? Riley asked. Call me Ethan, he said, not Dr. Cross, just Ethan. Riley smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Ethan understand why people talked about being able to feel someone's smile, even when you couldn't see their face. It was that kind of smile. Okay, she said. Ethan. They visited 2 more community centers that afternoon, one in Dorchester, one in Jamaica Plain. Both had similar challenges, similar needs, similar stories of patients falling through the cracks of a healthcare system that wasn't designed to catch them. By the time they finished at the 3rd location, it was almost 7 p.m., and the sun was setting over Boston in shades of orange and pink that probably would have been more impressive if Ethan's brain wasn't absolutely exhausted from a day of having his assumptions fundamentally challenged. They walked back to their cars in the parking lot of the Jamaica Plain location, and Riley turned to him. Thank you for today, she said, for actually listening, for actually caring. That matters. I should have been doing this all along, Ethan said. This kind of work, this kind of thinking. I got so caught up in the prestige and the research and the accolades that I forgot what medicine actually is. You can change that, Riley said, starting now. Can I? Ethan asked. Or am I just having a moment of emotional clarity that will fade once I'm back in my regular environment, surrounded by my regular people, doing my regular things? Do you want to change? Riley asked. That's the actual question. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. She was standing in the parking lot of a community center in Jamaica Plain, wearing a green sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, backlit by the sunset. She was asking him the most important question anyone had asked him in years. Yes, he said. I actually do. Riley nodded, like this was the answer she'd hoped for, but hadn't been entirely sure he'd give. Then come back next Friday, she said. We'll visit more communities. We'll keep building this program, and you keep working on being the kind of person who actually deserves to lead it. Deal? Deal, Ethan said. They drove home separately. Ethan back to Back Bay in his Tesla, Riley back to Cambridge in her practical Honda. But Ethan found himself thinking about her the entire drive, thinking about the way she'd challenged him, the way she'd shown him something he'd been missing. He was going to be different, starting now. Whether that was possible, whether he was capable of actual change and not just temporary good intentions, remained to be seen. But for the first time in a very long time, Ethan wanted to try. Ethan was still at the hospital at nearly midnight, which was not unusual for him. But what was unusual was that he was in the hospital library, surrounded by articles about community health initiatives, health equity, and cardiovascular disparities in underserved populations. He was reading a paper about implicit bias in cardiology care, a paper that made him deeply uncomfortable because it described people like him, physicians like him, making decisions based on unconscious assumptions rather than actual evidence. The research was damning. Patients in minority communities received fewer interventions for the same diagnoses. Women reported their chest pain symptoms and weren't believed. Older patients were dismissed as having anxiety rather than cardiac issues. And cardiologists, brilliant, well-intentioned cardiologists, perpetuated these disparities because they'd never been taught to recognize their own biases. Ethan had been one of those cardiologists. Still was, probably, despite his recent epiphanies. He heard footsteps and looked up to find Riley entering the library, wearing scrubs and carrying a cup of coffee that looked like it had been made sometime during the Clinton administration. "Still here?" she asked, surprised to find him. "It's almost midnight." "Research," Ethan said, gesturing at the papers spread across the table. "I'm trying to understand community health better, and also trying to understand how many ways I've probably been wrong about everything." Riley pulled up a chair and sat down, uninvited but not unwelcome. "Everything?" she asked. "Patients," Ethan said. "Care delivery. The assumptions I make based on demographics. Whether my intelligence actually makes me a good doctor or just a technically proficient one who doesn't care about the human being attached to the disease I'm treating." He looked at her. "Do you think I'm a good doctor?" Riley took a sip of her terrible coffee and considered the question seriously. "Technically," she said, "you're exceptional. I've seen your patient outcomes. I've seen how people respond when they know they're being treated by someone who's brilliant at what they do. But good," she paused. "Good requires caring about the person, not just the pathology. Good requires humility. Good requires recognizing that you don't know everything, and that not knowing everything doesn't diminish your value." "I'm not good then," Ethan said. "You could be," Riley said gently. "You're working on it, that's what matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the library around them quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of hospital machinery. "I went to therapy today," Ethan said suddenly. "The mandatory counseling they assigned. I was planning to treat it like a box to check, an obstacle to overcome. But I actually engaged with it. I talked about my childhood, my parents' expectations, the way I've always measured my worth through achievement." "How was that?" Riley asked. "Painful," Ethan said. "Productive. Definitely painful. The therapist pointed out that I use intelligence as a weapon and intimacy as a vulnerability. That I've constructed my entire identity around being superior, so I never have to be truly seen by anyone." "That's pretty insightful," Riley said. "It's pretty accurate," Ethan corrected. "Insight is worthless if it doesn't lead to change. I've had plenty of insight over the years. What I haven't had is willingness to actually change anything." He gathered up the papers, organizing them into a neat stack, because apparently even when discussing emotional breakthroughs, he had to maintain control over his physical environment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Why are you being so patient with me? I was terrible to you. I'm still not exactly warm and fuzzy. I'm probably going to say something insensitive at least once a week for the foreseeable future. Most people would have written me off by now." Riley leaned back in her chair, and Ethan watched her consider the question with the same seriousness she gave everything. "Because," she said slowly, "I've worked in healthcare long enough to know that the hardest people to reach are usually the people who are most worth reaching. The brilliant ones, the ones who've built these intricate defense systems because somewhere along the way, someone made them believe that being vulnerable was synonymous with being weak." She paused. "And because I think underneath the arrogance, you're actually a good person trying very hard not to be. I think you got lost in your own success and someone needed to tell you to sit down. I'm glad it was me." Ethan felt something crack open in his chest. Not painfully, but like ice breaking in spring, like the beginning of thaw. "I'm going to mess this up," he said. "The program, the changed behavior, all of it. I'm going to fall back into old patterns and be difficult and defensive and probably hurt your feelings at some point." "Probably," Riley agreed. but you'll apologize, and you'll keep trying. That's what growth is. It's not perfection. It's effort and mistakes and effort again. When did you become so wise? Ethan asked. I've always been this wise, Riley said with a small smile. You just weren't paying attention. You were too busy being superior. Ethan laughed, an actual laugh, not the controlled exhalation that usually passed for humor. It felt strange and good, and like something was fundamentally shifting in him. Come on, Riley said, standing up. You need sleep, and I need to finish my shift. We have a planning meeting tomorrow afternoon to finalize the first phase of the program. They walked out of the library together, through the quiet hallways of St. Catherine's. The hospital at night had a different quality than the hospital during the day. Calmer, more serious, stripped of some of the bustle that made it easy to avoid your own thoughts. Riley, Ethan said as they reached the elevator, thank you for the patience, for the challenge, for seeing something worth saving in me. Thank me by actually changing, Riley said. Not for me, for your patience, for yourself, because you deserve to be happy more than you deserve to be impressive. Ice! The elevator doors closed, and Ethan found himself alone with his reflection in the polished steel. For the first time in years, he looked at that reflection and didn't see arrogance or superiority. He saw someone exhausted by the weight of perfectionism, someone lonely from years of maintaining distance, someone who was finally willing to put down the armor and see what was underneath. The planning meeting with Riley and Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was productive in a way that Ethan was beginning to recognize as unusual for hospital administration meetings. Usually, these meetings involved PowerPoint presentations and strategic objectives and language that made actual human impact sound like an efficiency metric. This meeting was different. Riley had created a comprehensive outline of the Cardiology Outreach Initiative. The first phase would establish a monthly screening clinic at 3 community health centers in underserved Boston neighborhoods. The screening would be comprehensive: EKGs, basic laboratory work, blood pressure monitoring, and a cardiovascular risk assessment. Any patients identified as needing further evaluation would be connected to St. Catherine's Cardiology for follow-up care, with Ethan personally ensuring continuity. The second phase would involve training community health center staff in basic cardiac assessment and chronic disease management so they could handle ongoing monitoring without requiring constant specialist intervention. The third phase, the ambitious one, would be developing a peer education program, training community members to become health ambassadors who could educate their neighbors about cardiovascular health and risk factor modification. This is exceptional work, Dr. Okonkwo said, and she sounded like she genuinely meant it. This is the kind of programming that actually makes a difference. Ethan, I'm impressed by your commitment to this. I was half expecting you to phone it in. I was planning to, Ethan admitted, which earned him a surprised look from both women. But that was before I actually spent time in these communities, before I understood what the absence of our care means for real people, before I recognized that my privilege is directly connected to their lack of access. Well, Dr. Okonkwo said, exchanging a glance with Riley, this is promising. We'll allocate the resources you've outlined. Ethan, I'm assigning you protected time each week for this program. It's going to be part of your official responsibilities, not something you're doing on your own time. Riley, same for you. This becomes part of your position duties, and we're giving you a modest stipend for coordination work. You should probably think about hiring a community health worker from one of the neighborhoods to help with outreach. I have someone in mind, Riley said, glancing at Ethan. Mrs. Jackson, one of the patients we met at Roxbury Community Health. She's retired, she knows everyone, and she's passionate about this work. Perfect, Dr. Okonkwo said. Okay, I'm going to let you two work out the details. I'll need a full proposal for the hospital board by next week, and we should plan a press event once the first screening clinic is scheduled. This is a good story. Progressive hospital addresses healthcare disparities. The media will love it. After Dr. Okonkwo left, Ethan and Riley remained at the conference table, surrounded by papers and plans. "We're actually doing this," Riley said, sounding slightly amazed. "We are," Ethan confirmed. "And I meant what I said about the commitment. This isn't a box to check for me. This is actually something I want to do." Riley smiled, and Ethan was struck again by how much her smile changed her entire face. She was conventionally attractive. Dark eyes, olive skin, the kind of effortless beauty that didn't require makeup or styling. But what made her truly beautiful was the warmth in that smile, the intelligence in her eyes, the genuine care that radiated from her. He was developing a problem, he realized. He was developing genuine feelings for Riley Hayes, and she was his colleague, and they worked in a small community, and this was exceptionally complicated. "What?" Riley asked, apparently reading something in his expression. "Nothing," Ethan said quickly. Too quickly. "That's definitely not nothing," Riley said, tilting her head slightly in the way that suggested she was about to do something he wouldn't like, or possibly something he'd like far too much. "You got that look like you were thinking about something serious." "I was thinking about logistics," Ethan lied. "The timeline for the first screening clinic. When do you think we can be ready?" Riley continued to look at him like she knew he was lying and was choosing not to call him on it, for now. 3 weeks, she said. "We need to coordinate with the community centers, set up equipment, train the nursing staff who'll be assisting. Mid-October should be manageable." "Mid-October," Ethan agreed. "That's ambitious, but doable." They worked for another hour, dividing tasks, assigning responsibilities, building out the specific details of how this program would actually function. By the time they finished, it was past 5 p.m., and most of the hospital was transitioning between day shift and night shift. "Dinner?" Riley suggested as they packed up their materials. "I'm starving, and we've been working hard enough to justify actual food rather than hospital cafeteria selections." "Dinner," Ethan agreed, trying not to make this sound like something more than just colleagues grabbing food to discuss work. "There's a restaurant near here that's supposed to be good." "I know exactly where you mean," Riley said. "That fancy place with the chef who trained in France?" "That one," Ethan confirmed. "No," Riley said firmly. "Not there. I want somewhere with actual character, somewhere with food that tastes like something rather than looking like a work of art on a plate." "Where?" Ethan asked. "I know a place," Riley said mysteriously. "Trust me?" Ethan, who had spent the last week learning to trust Riley's instincts, agreed. The place turned out to be a small Italian restaurant in the North End, the neighborhood that Boston locals either loved or avoided depending on their tolerance for narrow streets and abundant history. The restaurant itself was tiny, with maybe 12 tables, and clearly family-run. The decorations were unpretentious. Old photographs on the walls, red and white checkered tablecloths, candles in wine bottles with years of dried wax accumulation. It was perfect. They ordered pasta. Ethan got something with seafood. Riley got a simple cacio e pepe and a bottle of wine that the owner recommended without consulting any particular wine list. The food was extraordinary in the way that simple, well-prepared food often was. The owner's grandmother apparently still came in to prepare the sauce, and it tasted like decades of care and attention. "This is much better than the French place," Ethan admitted after his first bite. "Of course it is," Riley said. "That place is all presentation and not enough soul. Food is supposed to nourish you, all of you, not just your stomach. This food is made with love." They talked for hours, first about the program, then gradually about everything else. Ethan found himself asking Riley questions and actually listening to the answers. He learned that she'd grown up in the neighborhood they were visiting for the outreach program, that her mother was a teacher and her father had died when she was 12, that her abuela was the reason she went into nursing. He learned that she loved reading, particularly historical fiction, and that she'd once wanted to be a writer but hadn't felt like she was talented enough. "That's ridiculous," Ethan said. You're extremely talented at communicating. Your writing in the program proposal was excellent. There's a difference between professional writing and creative writing, Riley said. And anyway, I'm happy as a nurse. I get to help people every day, that's enough. When they finished eating, it was almost 10 p.m. Ethan found himself not wanting the evening to end. "Walk with me?" he asked as they left the restaurant. They walked through the North End, through narrow cobblestone streets that felt more like stepping into history than moving through a modern city. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the restaurants closing up, the tourists gone for the night. "Can I tell you something?" Ethan said as they walked. "Something that's probably complicated and probably not appropriate." Riley, walking beside him in the cool October night, said, "Okay, I'm developing feelings for you," Ethan said bluntly, because he'd learned that directness was better than games. "Romantic feelings. And I recognize that this is problematic because we work together, because we're in the middle of an important professional project, because I was terrible to you a few weeks ago. But I wanted you to know. I wanted to be honest instead of pretending it's not happening." Riley stopped walking. She turned to face him on the narrow street, the light from a nearby restaurant window casting her face in soft shadows. "I have feelings for you too," she said quietly, "which is probably ridiculous because 3 weeks ago I wanted to introduce your head to a wall. But somewhere between that moment and now, I started seeing who you actually are underneath the arrogance, and who you're trying to become. And yes, it's complicated." "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. "How do we handle this?" "I don't know," Riley admitted. "I don't have experience with this kind of situation. I usually avoid getting involved with people who work in the same hospital. It's messy." "It is very messy," Ethan agreed. "But I'm not actually interested in pretending these feelings don't exist. Life is short. I'm tired of being careful and distant and afraid of being actually known by another person." He reached out and took her hand. Her hand was warm, her grip firm, her engagement with this moment absolutely present. "I want to try," he said. "I want to date you properly. Take you to dinner, spend time with you outside of work, see if this is something real or just proximity and shared purpose. I'll understand if you think it's too risky, but I wanted to ask instead of just letting the opportunity pass because it would be easier." Riley squeezed his hand. "Okay," she said, "let's try, but we need to be professional at work. No one needs to know yet. And if this ends badly, we need to be committed to making sure it doesn't tank the program." "Agreed," Ethan said. "We can do that." He wanted to kiss her. The desire was acute and immediate, and possibly terrifying because he'd never wanted anything this badly in his entire life. But he recognized that this was not the moment, and he was learning, slowly, painfully, with great effort, to respect other people's boundaries and timing. "Can I at least do this?" he asked, and kissed her hand instead. It was old-fashioned and slightly silly, and absolutely the right move, because it made her smile in a way that made him feel like he'd actually accomplished something real. They walked back to their cars in comfortable silence, holding hands, not talking because sometimes the absence of words was more honest than anything that could be said. When they reached their cars, parked on opposite sides of the street, Riley turned to him. "This is going to be difficult," she said. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "And we're going to fight about something eventually," Riley said. "Absolutely," Ethan confirmed. "And I might get upset with you," Riley said. "Very likely," Ethan said. "But I'm willing to try," Riley said. "For real. Not as a temporary thing until reality hits. For real." "For real," Ethan said. "I promise to try. And to keep trying even when it's hard. And to be honest when I'm struggling." They said goodnight, and Ethan drove home with the kind of lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced since he was much younger. Since before he'd decided that emotional distance was the price of intellectual superiority. He had 2 days before he saw Riley again. 2 days felt simultaneously too long and too short. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood why people did ridiculous things for love. He wasn't in love yet. It was too early for that. But he could see the possibility of it, and that possibility terrified him and exhilarated him in equal measure. Everything was going too well, which Ethan recognized intellectually meant that something was about to go badly. Life didn't maintain perfect equilibrium. The universe had a sense of irony, and he'd been genuinely happy for approximately 3 weeks, which statistically suggested that his good fortune had expiration dates. The problem started with a patient named David Torres. David was 42, a construction worker from Roxbury, and he'd come to the community screening clinic the previous week. The screening had revealed significant abnormalities, an EKG showing evidence of previous cardiac events, elevated cholesterol, hypertension that was completely uncontrolled, diabetes that he didn't know he had. Ethan had recommended that David come to St. Catherine's for a more comprehensive evaluation and a cardiac catheterization to assess the extent of coronary artery disease. David had shown up for his appointment yesterday afternoon, but he hadn't shown up for his scheduled procedure this morning. Ethan found out at 9:15 a.m. during cardiology rounds, when the interventional cardiologist mentioned that the Torres catheterization had been cancelled. "Patient didn't show," Dr. Jennifer Walsh said, reviewing the schedule. "Tried calling 3 times, no answer." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not the pleasant shift of a few weeks ago, but the sharp shift of dread. "Can someone track him down?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice level. "We can try," Dr. Walsh said. "But honestly, this happens all the time with these populations. They get scared, they don't understand the importance of follow-up, or they can't afford to take time off work. It's frustrating, but it's reality." It was the casual dismissal in her tone that did it. Ethan set down his coffee cup carefully, like if he didn't, he might throw it. "These populations," he repeated. "You mean people from underserved neighborhoods? People with limited healthcare literacy," Dr. Walsh said, not seeming to recognize the danger zone she was entering. "It's not their fault exactly, but it's a reality we have to work with. They don't prioritize their health the way insured, educated patients do." Ethan stood up from the conference table. "That's a racist, classist, thoroughly inaccurate generalization," he said quietly, the kind of quiet that made other residents shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "David Torres is terrified because he works in an environment where if he takes time off for medical appointments, he doesn't get paid. He's probably rationing medication because he can't afford his prescriptions. He's probably working 50-hour weeks because he's trying to support his family. And then we, sitting here in our comfortable positions with excellent insurance and job security, judge him for not being able to prioritize a cardiac catheterization that he can't actually afford." "I didn't mean," Dr. Walsh started. "I don't care what you meant," Ethan said. "I care about the impact. The impact is that we make assumptions about our patients based on their zip code, instead of recognizing systemic barriers that actually prevent them from accessing care. And then we blame them for those barriers as if they're personal failures instead of structural injustices." He left the conference room before anyone could respond, before he could say things that would be directly insubordinate, before he lost control of a situation that was rapidly spinning away from control. He found Riley on the 3rd floor, preparing medications for her morning rounds. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, pulling him into an empty patient room. Ethan told her about the screening, about David Torres, about Dr. Walsh's casual racism disguised as medical realism. "That's infuriating," Riley said, and her anger was immediate and genuine. "Did you report it?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "I came to talk to you first because I need to know if I'm being unreasonable. Is this actually a problem, or am I overreacting to something that everyone in medicine just accepts?" "It's absolutely a problem," Riley said firmly. "And the fact that it's normalized doesn't make it okay. You need to report this to Dr. Okonkwo, formally." "I'm going to," Ethan said. "But I also want to find David Torres. I want to understand why he didn't show up. I want to help him actually access the care he needs, instead of just running the test and assuming he'll figure out the follow-up on his own. That's good instinct, Riley said. Do you want me to help? Yes, Ethan said, but I need to be careful. I need to report the comment about these populations before I help David, or it's going to look like this is personal and not professional. They found Dr. Okonkwo in her office on the 4th floor. She looked up from her computer with the expression of someone who had learned to anticipate bad news from the way people appeared at her doorway. "Ethan," she said. "Riley, what's happened?" Ethan explained the situation, both the comment and the reasoning behind why he felt obligated to report it. Dr. Okonkwo listened carefully, took some notes, and then said, "I'm going to talk to Dr. Walsh directly. That kind of language, even when it's technically not slurs, contributes to a culture of bias that affects patient care. It needs to be addressed. Thank you for bringing this to me." "I also want to follow up with the patient," Ethan said. "David Torres. I want to understand what happened. I want to help him access care in a way that actually works for his life, not just the way that works for our institution." "That's excellent," Dr. Okonkwo said. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in medicine. Go help him." Finding David Torres turned out to be more complicated than expected. His phone number went to a disconnected voicemail. His address on file was a shelter in Roxbury. When Ethan and Riley drove there that afternoon, they found out that David had moved. Apparently, he'd been transitioning out of the shelter and didn't have a permanent address yet. They tracked him down through Mrs. Jackson, the woman they'd hired as a community health worker. Mrs. Jackson knew David's cousin. David's cousin knew that David had gotten construction work at a site in Dorchester and was staying with a friend while he looked for permanent housing. By 5:30 p.m., they found David sitting on the curb outside a construction site, still wearing his work clothes, looking exhausted and worried. "David?" Riley said, approaching him carefully. "Hi, I'm Riley. We met at the screening clinic. This is Dr. Cross. Can we talk for a minute?" David looked like he wanted to run. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tensed. "I know I missed the appointment," he said quickly. "I'm sorry. I was supposed to be at the site. My boss said if I took more time off, he'd have to let me go. I can't afford to lose the job. I've got 3 months of rent that needs to happen, and the shelter won't let me stay once I get my own place." Ethan felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't about healthcare literacy. This wasn't about not prioritizing health. This was about survival. This was about the impossible choices people made when systems were set up to make every decision potentially catastrophic. "David," Ethan said, sitting down on the curb next to him, "I need you to know that your health is important, that cardiac catheterization is important, but I also understand that you have to work, so let's figure out how to do both." Over the next hour, they worked out a plan. Ethan would schedule the procedure for a Friday, which meant David only had to take 1 day off work. Ethan would make sure the procedure happened quickly, without delays, and in the meantime, they'd start David on medications to stabilize his condition and get him connected to financial counseling to understand what his actual costs would be. "What about the construction work?" David asked. "Will I be able to go back?" "Eventually," Ethan said, "but probably not immediately after the procedure. You'll need some recovery time. What if I talk to your employer? If I explain the medical situation, would they be willing to give you a week off?" "My boss is not a sympathetic person," David said bluntly. "Let me try anyway," Ethan said. And because Ethan Cross, when he decided to be useful, could actually be exceptionally useful, he did get David's boss on the phone. He explained that David had a serious cardiac condition, that the procedure was necessary, that the week of recovery afterward was medically indicated. He used medical terminology in a way that sounded very official. He made it sound like not giving David the time off would constitute a liability issue for the company. The boss agreed to the time off. By 7 p.m., David had a scheduled procedure, a plan for his medications, and a path forward that didn't require him to choose between his health and his survival. As Ethan and Riley drove back to Boston, Riley reached over and squeezed his hand. "That was incredible," she said. "The way you figured out what the actual barrier was and solved for it instead of just assuming David was non-compliant. It should be standard practice," Ethan said. "But it's not. Most physicians just see non-compliance and assume it's a character flaw. We don't see the systems that make compliance impossible." "You're different than you were," Riley said. 3 weeks ago, you probably would have just scheduled the procedure and assumed it was David's responsibility to show up. 3 weeks ago, I was a different person," Ethan said. "And honestly, I wasn't a very good one." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, heading back toward Boston as the sun set over the highway. "I want to tell people," Riley said suddenly, "about us. I'm tired of pretending that we're just colleagues. I want to be able to hold your hand at work. I want to be able to say that we're together." Ethan felt something both wonderful and terrifying shift in his chest. "Are we together?" he asked. "I mean, we've gone on dates. We've spent time together outside of work, but I haven't actually asked you officially. Would you want to be in an actual relationship with me, like committed, exclusive, long-term relationship?" "Yes," Riley said simply. "I absolutely would." "Then let's tell people," Ethan said. "We'll be professional at work, but we won't hide it. People can handle it." They made the announcement on Monday at a department meeting. Ethan stood up in front of the entire cardiology department and said, "I wanted to let everyone know that Riley and I are in a relationship. We're going to remain professional at work, but I didn't want rumors or speculation. We're committed to making sure this doesn't affect the outreach program or our professional responsibilities." The response was mixed, but ultimately accepting. Some people were surprised. Some people looked vindicated, like they'd been expecting it. A few people seemed mildly disapproving, but they kept that to themselves. What surprised Ethan was that it felt good. It felt honest. It felt like he was finally allowing other people to actually know him instead of maintaining the illusion of professionalism that was really just another form of emotional distance. The problem came 2 weeks later, in the form of a patient named Margaret Mitchell. Margaret was 68, white, insured, and married to a man who was himself a retired cardiologist. She'd come to one of the specialty clinics at St. Catherine's with chest pain, and Ethan had evaluated her. Her EKG was normal. Her troponin was normal. Her chest pain sounded atypical for acute coronary syndrome. By all the standard metrics, Margaret didn't seem to have anything seriously wrong. But something in Ethan's instinct, something he'd been developing as he learned to listen to patients instead of just running tests, told him that Margaret's pain was real and significant. He recommended a cardiac MRI to look more carefully at the heart's structure and function. "That's excessive," his colleague Dr. Robert Harris said, reviewing the case. "The standard testing is negative. Additional imaging is just going to drive up costs and patient anxiety." "I want to be thorough," Ethan said. "You're being overzealous," Dr. Harris replied. "This is what happens when you start thinking about healthcare equity. Suddenly, everyone gets expensive testing whether they need it or not." The comment was meant to sound joking. It wasn't joking. "That's not what this is about," Ethan said quietly. "Isn't it?" Dr. Harris said. "You're suddenly very concerned about access to care for poor people, and now you're ordering expensive tests on wealthy patients to demonstrate your commitment to equity. It's performative, and it's wasteful." Ethan wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that his recommendation for Margaret had nothing to do with her insurance status and everything to do with his clinical judgment. But he recognized that he was defensive, and defensive meant that part of him knew the accusation had some validity. He ordered the cardiac MRI anyway, and it found it. A small area of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, that had caused her chest pain and could have progressed to something more serious if left untreated. The test had been necessary. His instinct had been correct. But when Dr. Harris found out about the results, he didn't apologize. Instead, he said, "One case doesn't justify routine overutilization. You're going to run up costs and create defensive medicine practices if you're not careful." Ethan left the conversation feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He found Riley in the medication room where she was restocking supplies. "I need to talk to you," he said, "but I'm not entirely sure what I'm upset about." They went to a quiet corner of the break room, and Ethan told her about the situation with Margaret and Dr. Harris's comments. Riley listened carefully, and when he finished, she said, "I think you're upset because you're recognizing something complicated." "Which is?" Ethan asked. "That being good at medicine is harder than you thought," Riley said gently. "It's not just about having the right test. It's about having the right test at the right time for the right reason. It's about balancing your instinct against clinical data, against cost considerations, against justice considerations, and sometimes those things conflict. So how do I know when I'm right?" Ethan asked. "You probably don't," Riley said. "You do your best, you stay humble, you listen to feedback, and you keep trying to improve. But you accept that sometimes you're going to be wrong, and sometimes people like Dr. Harris are going to be defensive about the way you practice medicine because it threatens their assumptions." "I'm tired," Ethan said. "I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of being told that I'm being performative when I'm actually trying to do better." Riley squeezed his hand. "That's valid," she said. "This work is hard. Changing is hard, and sometimes it feels impossible because people are invested in the old ways of doing things. But you're making a difference. The community outreach program is starting next week. We've already seen 40 patients in preliminary screenings. Mrs. Jackson tells me that people in her neighborhood are calling it a miracle. That's not performative. That's real." "What if it's not enough?" Ethan asked. "What if I spend my whole career trying to fix these systems and they don't actually change?" "Then you'll have still helped the people you could help," Riley said. "And you'll have modeled a different way of being a physician for the residents and students who learn from you. That's not nothing." Ethan leaned his head on Riley's shoulder, and she let him, even though they were technically in a public space, and people could see them. "I love you," he said, the words coming out before he'd entirely decided to say them. "I want you to know that. I'm not ready to make some grand gesture or have some big moment, but I wanted to tell you directly, when it's just us, and you understand the full context of everything I've been learning and becoming. I love you." Riley was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you too. And I'm going to keep loving you even when you're difficult, even when you doubt yourself, even when you're frustrated with the systems you're trying to change. That's what love is." "How did you get so wise?" Ethan asked. "I've always been this wise," Riley said, echoing words she'd said to him weeks before. "You're just finally paying attention." "Oi!" The first official community cardiology screening clinic happened on a Saturday morning, and the second one was being scheduled for the following weekend. The turnout had been extraordinary. 47 patients in the first clinic, countless stories of people who had been afraid, who had been avoiding medical care, who had finally been given access to evaluation and diagnosis and hope. Mrs. Jackson had become essential to the program. She welcomed patients, made them comfortable, explained procedures in language that didn't require a medical degree. She was paid a modest stipend, but her real compensation was the sense of purpose she'd gained, the feeling that her retirement years were actually meaningful. "This program is the best thing that's happened to this community in a long time," she told Ethan and Riley during a break in the clinic. "My grandson said to me, 'Grandma, you're saving lives.' And I said, 'No, these doctors are.' But then I thought about it and I realized, I'm the bridge. I'm the reason people trust this enough to show up." Ethan found himself thinking about that as he drove Riley home after the clinic ended. He was thinking about bridges and connection and the way that sometimes the most important work in medicine wasn't the brilliant diagnosis or the technically perfect procedure. Sometimes it was just being a person willing to meet another person where they were. "Are you happy?" Riley asked as they drove through the quiet streets. "Yes," Ethan said, surprising himself with how true it was. "I'm actually happy. I'm anxious about the work, and I'm frustrated with systemic barriers, and I'm probably going to continue saying insensitive things occasionally despite my best efforts. But underneath all of that, yes, I'm genuinely happy." "Good," Riley said, squeezing his hand. "You deserve that." They drove in silence for a while, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest. The sense of rightness, the sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the right person, doing exactly the right work. Of course, this was the moment the universe decided to introduce complication. His phone rang. It was Dr. Okonkwo. "I need you to come back to the hospital," she said, and her tone suggested that it wasn't a request. "We have a situation." The situation turned out to be David Torres. He was in the emergency department, having arrived via ambulance approximately 2 hours before Ethan received the call. He'd collapsed at home, chest pain severe, accompanied by shortness of breath. His wife had called 911. The paramedics had brought him in with a preliminary diagnosis of acute coronary syndrome. Ethan found him in a monitored bed, looking terrified and pale, and exactly like a man whose worst fears had become reality. "David," Ethan said, pulling up a chair. Riley stood in the corner, trying to be present without intruding. "I'm here. Tell me what happened." David's voice was shaky. "I was at home, I was feeling fine, and then suddenly there was this pain right here." He gestured to his chest. "And I couldn't breathe. My wife called the ambulance. They said it might be another heart attack." "It might be," Ethan said honestly. "Or it might be something else. What we're going to do is get more information. Your EKG showed some concerning changes. We're going to move you to the catheterization lab and do the procedure we discussed, the one we scheduled for next month. We're going to look at your coronary arteries and see what's happening." "Right now?" David asked. "Right now," Ethan confirmed. "Because right now is when your heart needs help, and we're going to be here the entire time." The procedure took 90 minutes. What they found was significant coronary artery disease, more significant than the initial screening had suggested. David had 2 critical blockages that had previously gone undetected. One of them had likely caused the acute event he was currently experiencing. Without intervention, he would have had a major heart attack, possibly fatal. Ethan placed 2 stents, reopening the arteries, restoring blood flow. When David's heart rhythm stabilized, when the procedure was complete, Ethan felt the kind of relief that came from knowing he'd done something that genuinely mattered. But he also felt something else, profound anger. He found Riley in the waiting area where she'd been sitting with David's wife while the procedure happened. "He almost died," Ethan said without preamble. "If we hadn't done the community screening, if we hadn't found those blockages at the initial evaluation, he would have had a massive heart attack, possibly fatal. He has 3 children, Riley. 3 children who would have lost their father because his job didn't give him time to access medical care." "I know," Riley said quietly. "This shouldn't be how medicine works," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger and frustration and the kind of despair that came from seeing systemic injustice made manifest in a human body. "No one should have to almost die to access preventative care. No one should have to choose between their job and their health. No one should have to wait until their condition is life-threatening to get medical attention." "I know," Riley said again, "and you're changing that. You created the community screening program. You found David's disease early enough to treat it. You saved his life, Ethan. You actually saved his life." "But I shouldn't have had to," Ethan said. "It shouldn't require one cardiologist deciding that equity matters to make sure people get basic care." Riley pulled him into a quiet corner of the waiting room. away from David's family, away from other staff members. "You're right," she said. "It shouldn't. The system should be different, and you're going to spend your career working toward that. But right now, in this moment, you saved David Torres's life. You met him where he was. You understood his constraints. You worked within a broken system to give him what he needed. That matters." "It's not enough," Ethan said. "No," Riley agreed. "It's not. But it's what's possible right now. And sometimes you have to accept that progress is incremental, that changing systems takes decades, that what you can do today is help the people in front of you. Tomorrow, maybe you'll help more people. But today, you help David." The hospital board meeting regarding the community outreach program was supposed to be a celebration. The first clinic had been successful. David Torres's case, while dramatic, demonstrated the program's value. The media had run stories about the hospital's commitment to health equity. Donors were interested. Other hospitals were asking about replicating the model. It should have been a clear win. Instead, Dr. Robert Harris raised his hand during the presentation and said, "While I appreciate the sentiment behind this program, I have concerns about the financial sustainability. We're spending significant resources to screen patients who largely can't pay for subsequent treatment. This is creating a referral pipeline to our hospital, yes, but it's also creating uncompensated care obligations that our margins can't support indefinitely." Dr. Okonkwo responded before Ethan could. "The hospital has committed to funding this program as part of our community mission. That commitment is separate from our clinical margins." "But for how long?" Dr. Harris pressed. "Until the next financial pressure? Until a new administration comes in with different priorities? We're setting expectations in these communities that we're going to sustain a level of care that we might not actually be able to provide long-term. So we should just not serve them at all," Ethan heard himself saying. His voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that made people listen. "Because we might have to stop in the future. That's the calculus. We do good now, but we don't do it if we might have to stop later." "That's not what I'm saying," Dr. Harris said. "It's exactly what you're saying," Ethan said, standing up. "You're saying that doing the right thing is conditional, that serving vulnerable populations is only acceptable if it doesn't create any burden on those of us with resources. That's not equity. That's not medicine. That's just protecting privilege." "You're being emotional about this," Dr. Harris said. "I'm being honest about this," Ethan replied. "And yes, I'm emotional about it because I had a patient almost die yesterday because he couldn't afford to take time off work to access preventative care. I held his wife's hand while she was terrified that her husband wasn't going to survive. And you're sitting here talking about financial sustainability like his life is a line item in a budget." Dr. Okonkwo stood up, which was apparently the signal that this meeting was concluded. "The board is committed to the program," she said firmly. "We've already approved the budget. We're already seeing results. This isn't a debate about whether we should do it. We're doing it. The question is whether we're going to expand it based on demand. And my recommendation to the board is yes, we expand. We make this a flagship program. We make St. Catherine's the model for equitable cardiology care in the region." The board voted. 7 in favor of expansion, 1 abstention, 0 against. Even Dr. Harris didn't vote against it. He just abstained, which was its own form of protest. After the meeting, Ethan found himself in a bathroom stall, trying to calm down, trying to manage the overwhelming sense of fury and frustration. Riley found him there. She had a way of knowing where he was when he needed her, and she didn't say anything. She just stood outside the stall and waited until he came out, and then she handed him paper towels and stood with him while he washed his hands. "I can't do this," Ethan said. "I can't keep fighting these battles. I can't keep running up against people who think that equity is optional, that serving vulnerable populations is charity rather than justice." "You don't have to do it alone," Riley said quietly. That's the thing you haven't learned yet. You don't have to carry this by yourself. You have me. You have Dr. Okonkwo. You have Mrs. Jackson and the community health workers. You have all the patients whose lives you're changing. That's not nothing. It feels like nothing when it's up against centuries of systemic racism and healthcare disparity, Ethan said. Then maybe you shift your perspective, Riley said. Instead of looking at how much you can't change, look at how much you are changing. David Torres is alive today because of you. His children have their father because you decided that his life mattered. That's not nothing. That's everything. The 6th community screening clinic was a celebration. They'd screened more than 200 patients over the 6-week period. They diagnosed 43 cases of significant coronary artery disease. They'd connected 87 patients with managed hypertension to ongoing care. They'd changed lives. The community center was decorated for a celebration, streamers, refreshments, people. Mrs. Jackson had organized it, apparently with the help of her extensive network throughout the neighborhood. There were patients they'd treated, family members of patients, community leaders, and representatives from other hospitals who were interested in replicating the program. Ethan found himself giving a speech that he hadn't prepared, speaking from the heart in a way that his pre-Riley self never would have done. 6 weeks ago, he said, standing in front of the community, I was a cardiologist who didn't understand why people in these communities weren't accessing care. I thought it was a character problem. I thought it was a lack of health literacy. I thought it was individual failure to prioritize health. I was wrong, very wrong. What I've learned is that the problem isn't individuals. The problem is systems designed to make healthcare inaccessible for people without significant resources. And that's not something you fix with judgment. That's something you fix with commitment, with resources, with someone willing to say that your life matters. That's what this program is. It's a commitment that your lives matter, that you deserve to be healthy, that you deserve to be alive. He looked at David Torres, who was standing with his wife and children, all of them looking healthy and present and alive. David almost died, Ethan said. 6 weeks ago, if we hadn't started this program, if he hadn't come to our screening clinic, he would have had a catastrophic heart attack. His children would have lost their father. His wife would have lost her partner. And that would have been a tragedy that could have been prevented. It could have been prevented if he'd had access to care. It could have been prevented if the system didn't force him to choose between his job and his health. I'm grateful to be part of the work to change that system. I'm grateful to every person who's been part of this program. And I'm grateful to Riley Hayes, who had the courage to tell me when I was wrong and the patience to help me become better. He looked at Riley, standing near the back of the room, and she smiled at him in a way that made him remember why he'd changed. Not just for professional reasons, not just because he'd realized he was wrong, but because Riley had shown him that there was another way to be human, another way to be a doctor, another way to live that was built on genuine connection instead of intellectual superiority. After the event, as people were leaving, Ethan pulled Riley outside to a quieter area of the community center grounds. I have something to ask you, he said, and his heart was pounding in a way that suggested this was important, which it was. Okay, Riley said, looking slightly wary. She knew he did things in specific ways when they mattered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. It contained a ring, simple, elegant platinum with a single diamond, chosen after weeks of consultation with Riley's best friend to make sure it was exactly right. I know we've only been together for about 3 months, Ethan said, hearing his own voice shake slightly. I know that's not a lot of time, but I also know that I love you more than I've loved anyone in my entire life. I know that you've changed me fundamentally. I know that I don't want to imagine a future that doesn't include you. So I'm asking, will you marry me? Not right now necessarily, not tomorrow, but eventually. Will you say yes to a future with me? Riley's eyes filled with tears. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes, but not eventually. Soon. I want to marry you soon, Ethan. I want to build a life with you. I want to keep changing you and having you change me. I want to do this work together." Ethan kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that people saw and understood was a declaration of commitment, of love, of choosing each other even when everything was complicated. When they broke apart, Riley was crying and laughing at the same time. "I can't believe I'm engaged," she said. "I can't believe I'm lucky enough to be marrying you," Ethan replied. "Don't forget to subscribe, give us a like, and comment from which city you're watching and which moment made your heart race. Your rating helps us bring more stories like this one to you.